For those of you just joining us, we'll begin in a few minutes. Thank you for joining us today. We'll begin in just a moment. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I am the Assistant Director at Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for our travel talk. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly cover a few housekeeping items. I know many of us are familiar with the Zoom webinar platform. However, for those of you joining us for the first time, I'd like to mention a few technical observations to best prepare you for this lecture. Throughout the talk, your microphone will be muted and your video will be turned off so we can direct our attention to our speaker. However, the chat feature at the bottom of your screen will be on and accessible throughout the lecture. So please feel free to include your comments in the chat box and your questions in the Q&A box. We are offering live closed captioning during this lecture. For those of you interested in using this feature, please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Our webinar, which will be recorded, will last 1 hour, including time for Q&A. At the conclusion of our program, a very brief survey will appear. We'd be grateful if you would take the time to complete this survey so we can continue to better serve you. And finally, while we hope this lecture will run smoothly, we could experience glitches or delays in speech due to the constraints of technology and the embedded videos within this talk. We appreciate your patience and understanding should this occur. If you are having Zoom technical difficulties, please note this lecture is live streamed to YouTube, so you are welcome to join us that way. Please find the YouTube link in the chat. My favorite way to start our talk is by inviting all of you to enter your location in the chat so we can see where we're all tuning in from. Let's take a look. Thank you. It appears that we have about 350 people gathered here today from all over the world. Thank you again for being with us. Now, to our Travel Talks lecture, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Zarin Machanda, the Usen Family Career Development Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Tufts University. I've had the privilege of getting to know Zarin over the years, in part because she has led almost 10 Harvard travel trips. Zarin not only graciously shares her time and knowledge with us, but also her astonishing trip photos, videos, and stories. For those of you who've had the opportunity to travel with her, you know this firsthand. Zarin's research revolves around understanding the factors that shape the quality and development of social relationships among wild chimpanzees. Recently, she and other colleagues published groundbreaking research that shows what is believed to be the first evidence of non-human animals deliberately selecting who they socialize with during aging. Zarin, we're so excited to hear more about your fascinating work. So let's turn things over to Zarin to start her lecture, What Old Chimps Can Tell Us About Healthy Aging.
Hi, Piper. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's really my pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about my research, which is, this is the latest research we've done on chimpanzee aging. I'd like to say thank you to the Harvard Alumni Association for hosting me today. I hope to be able to travel with all of you again soon. And a very, very warm hello to some of my past travelers who I see attending today. I miss all of you. I wish we could go somewhere very soon together again. So today I want to tell you a little bit about some work that we've had recently published about chimpanzee social aging. And hopefully by the end of this talk, I'll be able to kind of give you some insight into what this can tell us about how humans age and what we can learn from chimpanzees. One caveat I will say is that I am, as my mother likes to call me, a monkey doctor. So as much as she often calls me about her ailments, what I'm hoping to do today is not really give you any medical advice or feedback necessarily about specific things that you might be able to do to slow your aging down. But what I want to do is give us, or give you, some information to help us reframe how we think about human aging and how chimpanzees can help in that kind of discussion. So humans, as we probably are all aware of, are actually living longer lives than ever before. But a lot of scientific research about human aging really focuses on the pathology of aging or diseases related to aging. And as a result, a lot of the animal literature about aging is really more about kind of biomedical models of disease. So thinking about we have a lot of mouse or rat models to understand Alzheimer's. And every so often you might see, studies of marmosets or primates, things that are even more closely related to humans in some of those studies. But really, a lot of times the way we think about human aging is in the sense of disease or deficits or things that we're losing, rather than maybe kind of a more positive spin on aging. And what I'd like to propose is that wild chimpanzees, like the ones I study at my field project, the Kibale Chimp Project, could be in many ways thought of as a model for healthy aging. And so what I'm trying to do today is show you a little bit of data about chimps and their aging process, and to try to think about what that might mean for viewing what humans are going through and how humans change in a more positive, kind of healthy way. So I am an evolutionary biologist, and so I often also think about chimpanzees from this evolutionary perspective as our closest living relative on Earth. And so we often go to chimpanzees to understand things about humans and how humans have changed in evolutionary time, because we share that common ancestor with them that lived about 6 to 7 million years ago. And I would argue that chimpanzee data are really essential to understanding things about our own species, especially as it relates to aging or the life history, things that happen to us as we grow older. Now, what you'll see from this graph is kind of the lifespan of different species broken down into different developmental periods. So one of the things that's striking about humans is our very, very long period of infancy and juvenility and adolescence. And I often tell my students, kind of as a joke, I'll have them raise their hands, and this is, a group of 20-year-olds, and I'll say, how many of you are still dependent on your parents? It turns out most of them are. And so humans are characterized by this really long period of development. And that's been the focus of a lot of studies. And chimpanzee data are essential for this as well, because chimps and other great apes have that long period of development. But what's interesting about humans is as humans age, we actually have this very, very long post-reproductive lifespan. So women go through menopause around the age of 50. And then they still live, 3 decades plus beyond that point. Now, chimpanzees don't really show much evidence for menopause, especially in the wild, but they do have very long lifespans. And so they will live between 50 and 60 years in the wild. And a lot of studies kind of take this whole period of adulthood and try to think about it in the same way. But in reality, when you look at chimps, they really reach kind of a peak or prime age around the age of 30. And then many of them live 2-3 decades beyond that point. And so they might not have the same kind of post-reproductive life that we do, but they do experience what we would kind of think of as old age. Now, there are a lot of other similarities between chimps and humans that make chimps a really interesting model organism to think about human aging. First of all, like I said, chimpanzees have these long lives, but chimps and the other apes also have these kind of large brains, or relatively large brains for our body size. And they exhibit a lot of interesting cognitive complexity. And so just like us, chimpanzees make complicated decisions about their lives in the same way that humans do. And of great importance, I think, is that chimpanzees are also an extremely social species, just like us. And so in that sense, we can start to understand in this organism how social behavior might play a role in healthy, successful aging. The one nice thing about chimpanzees, there are a lot of nice things about chimps, but one of the things that's interesting for studies of aging is that chimpanzees don't have what we call cohort effects. So for example, if you wanted to do a study of, 80-year-olds or 90-year-olds here, in the world, you'd have to, for humans, you'd have to deal with the fact that most of those people would have lived through something like World War II, and all of them would have that impact. And so when we look at similarities or patterns of aging in that cohort, we can't get rid of the fact that they all had this kind of profound socioeconomic impact early in their lives. Now, we don't have that kind of complex kind of cultural input going on in the lives of these chimpanzees. The other really nice thing about chimpanzees compared to studies of human aging is that we can get incredibly detailed data on the lives of these individuals, and data that would be a human biologist's dream. I mean, we can follow these individuals for every single minute that they are awake and collect data on them. And there is no human data set that has that kind of detail. So there are some really lovely reasons why we can think about chimpanzees as a model organism. So I am one of the directors of the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, which has been studying the Kanyawara community of chimpanzees living in Kibale National Park, Uganda, for the last 33 years. We were started in 1987 by Harvard professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, Richard Wrangham. And then down the road, he has since retired, but about 10 years ago, he asked me and two of his former graduate students to kind of take over the day-to-day running of that field site. So along with myself, Melissa Emery Thompson, and Martin Muller, we run this long-term field site. And many of you will be familiar with Jane Goodall's field site, Gombe. That's a research site in Tanzania. We're very similar in many ways. We've been around for more than 3 decades, and many of the data collection techniques that we use were pioneered by Jane Goodall's site. And Richard Wrangham was actually one of the first students who did his PhD at Gombe Stream National Park. So to get you in the mood and to kind of, help you imagine yourself in the rainforest of Uganda, I'm going to show you a couple of videos of our field site and what it's like to watch the chimps. First, our chimps are so well habituated to human observation, having been studied for almost every day of the last 33 years by humans. They're pretty just nonchalant about us. They really don't seem to pay much attention to us at all. And we're lucky enough that our chimps are so used to us that they even allow us to climb into the trees. So I'd like to start with this video to give you a sense of what it's like to kind of be in a tree with a chimpanzee, and it gives you a nice kind of treetop view of the forest. And that is actually about 50 meters off the ground. So we are actually strapped in, and it's all very, very safe. And as I mentioned, a lot of us have been interested in not just aging, but early development and infancy. And so we do get really lovely observation time on the ground with the chimpanzees. They spend 50% of their time in trees, 50% on the ground. And if you happen to have the pleasure of following moms and their babies, you get to see a lot of just ridiculous play behavior, which I'm going to show you here. fun and games in the lives of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have a pretty strict dominance hierarchy, and especially for the adult male chimpanzees. And so there is often, when we're on the ground with them, or even when they're in the trees, a lot of aggression that we observe during the day. There's also lots of very, very interesting complex social behavior, which I'll tell you about. Here's just a nice little clip of a dominance interaction. The chimp that you see on the screen currently is named Kakama, and he, at the time the video was taken, was the alpha male in the group. And in this short clip, you'll actually see him walk by another chimpanzee named Tuke, and Tuke's low ranking. He's quite a young adult male. And you'll hear Tuke give a very kind of loud, emphatic, subordinate signal called a pant bark. So chimpanzees will give this kind of vocalization to the dominant individuals as a way of saying, I get it, you're dominant, please don't beat me up, please don't beat me up. So we can collect data on all of those vocalizations and signals, and that's how we understand what the dominance hierarchy is. And so after collecting that data, it's very obvious that Kakama was the alpha male. So just a little bit more just some terms to help you understand chimpanzees a little bit better. Chimpanzees are in many ways very special as a primate because they exhibit a particular kind of social organization that's quite rare among primates and mammals called fission-fusion. So the group that I study has about 50 to 60 individuals in it at any one time, but we never actually see those individuals all together all at once. And instead, what you see are these chimps break apart into subgroups throughout the day, come together, break apart, come together, break apart. And this is actually what humans do. So if you think about it, I don't know exactly how many people are on the call right now, but all 300 plus of us are not going to go to our next Zoom call all together. We will break up and then maybe come together, some of us later. And that's what chimpanzees do. And this means that actually chimpanzees have a lot of control over their social lives in ways that other animals don't. If someone is bothering them, they can just leave and join someone else. So they do have a lot of control over who their friends are. Chimpanzees are primarily frugivorous, so 50% of their diet is ripe fruit, which means that they spend a lot of their time kind of moving around the forest trying to find the best food. Chimpanzees, and this is important for the rest of this talk, are male philopatric, which means that the male chimpanzees are born into the group and they spend their whole lives in that same group. Whereas female chimpanzees are born into a group and then will transfer to a new group, a neighboring group at adolescence. And that means partly we think this is to avoid incest so that they are not breeding with their fathers and brothers. But it does mean that what tends to happen as a result of this is that males have much stronger social bonds than females, since they're in groups with their relatives and also just have this time, all of this time together. So males tend to be much more social, which is why most of the data in this talk is going to really focus on males. Females are often solitary, but when they are, and they're often with their kids, when it's time for them to have another kid or their first child, they exhibit what we call a sexual swelling, which is a swelling of the genital tissue in response to, ovarian hormones. And this is a signal to particularly males in the group that they are ovulating and ready to mate. And so females with these swellings are very exciting. They get a lot of attention, and we tend to get really big groups around that time. So I think probably a lot of us are aware of what the human aging phenotype is kind of like. We do tend to get a little weaker with age, a little bit more frail with age. And there are all sorts of things that have been documented about the human aging phenotype. So I want to give you an example of how we might use our chimpanzee data, kind of a more physiological context, to say something about the human aging phenotype. So one of the things that happens in the human body as we age is that we see an increase in glucocorticoid levels. And glucocorticoids are kind of colloquially known as the stress hormone. So they're often released in stressful situations as a way to kind of deal with that. And we see elevated levels of cortisol, which is the human glucocorticoid, in old age. And in particular, what we see is actually what I'm showing here, which is actually data from our female chimps, which is that in most species, in almost all species, and in chimps and humans, we see kind of a very characteristic diurnal pattern in cortisol. So that cortisol is quite high in the morning, and then it levels out in the evening. But what we see in humans as we age is kind of a leveling off of this diurnal pattern. And a lot of people had thought about that increase in cortisol in human aging as maybe just a side effect of our really extended lifespan, or maybe a byproduct of recent shifts in lifestyle that make aging maybe more stressful for humans. But what we found when we did this with chimpanzees, I'm just showing females here, but this is also true of males, is that this pattern actually also exists in chimpanzees. So older chimpanzees have elevated levels of cortisol, and you don't see, you kind of see these elevations, especially later in the day. Now, what's interesting is we were also able to link this to social data and kind of things that might stress chimps out. And this elevated cortisol is not in chimpanzees a response to a more stressful lifestyle. There's no evidence from our social data that these older chimps are handling stress or are being stressed more or are more responsive to that stress. This just seems to be kind of a physiological pattern of aging that is at least true across chimpanzees and humans, and is most likely just part of a dysregulation of this cortisol mechanism. So as we age, as humans age, and we release cortisol to a stressor, we just have a little bit of a harder time turning off that response, which results in these elevated levels. But it's not actually true that this is because older people are necessarily more stressed, or that there's something about our recent shift in lifestyle that is doing this. This is something that is evolutionarily shared across or with our closest living relative. So that's kind of a way of thinking about how we might interpret human data in a different way, given the results that we're finding from wild chimpanzees. But I'm actually mostly interested in social aging and how our social relationships change with age. And this has really actually been a kind of a hot button topic for the last 10 years at least. This is one of my favorite studies to show when I talk about human aging. This is a meta-analysis that included about 158 different studies on mortality risk factors. So things that affect or have an impact on your survival. And what they were able to show, and I'll walk you through this graph a little bit, is there are things like giving up smoking or giving up drinking or reducing drinking that actually have a positive impact on your mortality or on your survival. So if you give up smoking, that's going to have a positive impact on you surviving. What's interesting is that these also found that social bonds, social relationships in particular, and your integration into society have an incredibly powerful effect on your survival. So individuals who were more integrated into society compared to less integrated into society had a 91% greater survival ratio than individuals who are less integrated into society. And so there are lessons you might take from this. One lesson is that you can smoke and drink, but you have to do it with friends at least. But I think the bigger lesson is that it does appear from this study, along with many others that have been done since, that social relationships are incredibly important for our survival, for our satisfaction as we get into our older years. And so that has actually led to a lot of push in terms of policy changes about how deal with or how we create programs for elderly people. And I will talk a little bit about that towards the end of the talk. But besides kind of the importance of social bonds, there is actually a very characteristic pattern of social aging that we see around the entire world. And so that's really interesting that it's these, when I'm talking about a human social aging phenotype, I'm not just talking about those of us who live in the United States or in England. This is really a worldwide phenomenon that seems independent of culture. So what's really interesting to me is that all of the data show that humans actually shift towards more positive thinking and more positive behaviors. And so I know that there's this caricature out there of grumpy old people, but that's actually not true. Most seniors actually view the world with rose-colored glasses. So they kind of shift their behaviors and shift their thinking towards more positive things. The human data do show that social networks shrink, but older people report more satisfaction in their relationships than younger people. And individuals, as humans, as they age, become much more selective in their kinds of friendships and the people that they spend time with. So this is the phenomenon. This is what humans do as we age. Now, a number of us and researchers have really been interested in why we see this pattern. And in particular, psychologists have come up with kind of the most dominant explanation for this shift towards more positive thinking and more selective bonds. In terms of this theory called socio-emotional selectivity theory. So this is the dominant explanation, and I'll walk you through it. So socio-emotional selectivity theory basically states that when we are younger, we are really focused on seeking information. And so what we do is we have these big social networks so we can gather information about what our social world is like, and we're really testing things out. Now, as we get older, we don't need any more knowledge. We have figured out how the world works. And so we shift to prioritizing our emotional needs rather than our knowledge needs. And so older adults focus on regulating their emotions and engaging in positive relationships. Now, it's kind of interesting. So what this theory, the reason that so people who kind of subscribe to this socio-emotional selectivity theory, the reason for this is that it really is for psychologists about the fact that humans have this ability to monitor time and our knowledge of mortality. So this is my dad. I know he's actually the perfect picture of a grumpy old man here. He has since passed, but he was actually someone who had very rose-colored glasses later in his life. But as humans age, this theory specifically kind of talks about the fact that we as humans have an ability to monitor time, to think and project ourselves really far into the future and know that time is running out. And so as time is essentially running out on us, we don't want to have or put up with negative things or think about things negatively or prioritize negative influences in our life. And so we really focus on positive thinking and positive bonds. Now, there is no indication really that chimpanzees have a knowledge of their own mortality, but more importantly, they don't really have the ability to monitor time or a sense of time that's at all equal to what humans have. So at most, experiments have been able to show that chimps have maybe a knowledge of or an ability to put themselves into the future, maybe for a few hours or maybe the next day, but nothing in terms of like many years into the future. And so as we were kind of thinking about social aging, we thought, well, wouldn't chimpanzee data be incredibly interesting to test the socio-emotional selectivity theory? Now, if chimpanzees have the same kind of phenotype or pattern that humans have, then we really have to reassess whether this is about a sense of mortality or our understanding of time, maybe explained by something completely different. If chimps have a different pattern than humans, then this is really good support for this particular theory. And so my colleagues and I actually did this study, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. And we were lucky and happy that it actually got into Science magazine, which was published almost a month and a half ago. And we were really thrilled that one of our chimps actually made the cover of Science. And so I'd like to make a shout out to Dr. Alex Rosati, who is the co-author of this study. She's a professor at the University of Michigan, but was undergraduate at Harvard, which is actually how I first got to know her. And also to Lindsay Hegberg, who was one of the co-authors on this study. And I think this is a really lovely science story in many ways, because this study started first because Lindsay took a class with me at Harvard where she did some of this preliminary analysis as her final paper for the class. It then turned into her senior thesis. And I think this is a great example of how at Harvard, we involved students in research, and this is not just kind of silly research. This is really exciting, groundbreaking research. I think it's also a nice science story because Alex Rosati is a psychologist, and I am a primatologist, so really focus more on behavior. And it was in just hallway conversations that we had at Harvard that this study really came to be. And that's actually one of the things that I think a lot of us are missing the most about the pandemic, and being kind of not able to have a lot of those kinds of great science conversations that can result in really interesting work. So let me tell you a little bit about this study. We used long-term data from our field site, so about 20 years of data. One of the things about if you're going to study aging and the aging process, especially for an animal that lives 50 plus years, is you need a lot of data. So we used a lot of data. Some of our data tables have millions of rows in them, so it's quite an endeavor. And we had, like I said, 21 male chimpanzees who ranged in age from 15 to 58. So the first question we wanted to explore is, what is the general pattern of aging in chimpanzees? And do we, in particular, see the same kind of positivity bias that we see in humans? And so it's hard sometimes to translate data from animals into data, something that's comparable to humans. But chimpanzees do exhibit positive behaviors and negative behaviors. So one of their positive behaviors that's very affiliative and in many ways relaxing is something that we call grooming, where social grooming, where they're sitting next to another individual and just they're cleaning each other and they're going through their fur and picking out their fur. And what we see with our grooming data, which is shown here in blue, is that there's not a big change in grooming with age. So grooming stays pretty consistent with age. What is important is this decrease in the red and orange lines, which are markers of aggression. And aggression is our metric of negative behavior. I mean, this is really, they're really combating other individuals. We have two different kinds of aggression. One in orange is directed, where there's an individual who's a target. In red, it's just kind of displays and dominance displays and just kind of going crazy, but not necessarily targeted. Importantly, we see decreases in both. And so the way that we interpret this is that we are actually seeing a shift towards more positive behaviors and away from negative behaviors if you look at kind of the ratio between grooming and aggression. So here we have evidence that chimpanzees are showing a positivity bias. We next wanted to ask whether chimpanzees shift their relationships with age. And what I'm going to show you next is, I think, one of my all-time favorite graphs from a paper. But the way that we kind of think about chimpanzee social bonds is we do actually kind of think about different individuals being able to form friendships with each other. And we have two kinds of friendships that we looked at. The first is in green, lopsided friendships. And so lopsided friendships are the ones where I'm constantly making positive overtures towards you, but you're not reciprocating back to me. So I often think of this as like younger siblings always wanting to be around their older siblings, but older siblings really not wanting to have anything to do with their baby brother or baby sister. That's something that we would think of as lopsided. Whereas a mutual friend is really someone who reciprocates that kind of feeling or that kind of positive sentiment. And what we found is that chimpanzees in general always have about 4 friends. That's kind of how, that's about what they can manage. But as chimpanzees age, they shift much more towards these mutual friends that are reciprocated. So they're really not investing at all into individuals who do not reciprocate back that same kind of sentiment. And that is, I think it's pretty obvious from this graph, a big shift in chimpanzee social behaviors. And so it's interesting, there's no difference in the actual number of friends, but in this ratio. So again, something that's indicative of more positive thinking. What's kind of interesting, and this is a little bit of maybe a confusing graph to look at, but here we have the proportion of mutual friends in different age categories. So here we have for older adults, how many of their mutual friends are young, prime-aged, or older. And what we can see is that everyone really has a preference to be friends with these older individuals. They really, a lot of their friends, a lot of these older chimps' friends are other old chimps, which I think is kind of interesting. If you look at the lopsided friends and you particularly focus on these young adults, you'll see young adults are really drawn towards older individuals, including these older adults. And so there's something that's going on here where these older male chimps are actually quite popular. I mean, they have a lot of social capital that we still really need to try to understand. But these are not chimps that are being relegated to kind of the sidelines. They're really central in this group, and they're really desirable social partners. Now, are these do they invest more in these friendships? So do we see kind of a little bit of that selectivity towards, yes, we're seeing they have more mutual friends. What are they doing with these mutual friends? What is their kind of investment? To look at this, we calculate what we call a grooming index, where we look at the amount of grooming they give to each other, controlled for the time that they spend together. And what we found is that everyone, so if you look at these blue bars, which are mutual friends, everyone grooms their mutual friend more than they would groom other individuals. And we did lots and lots of different metrics for this. So we looked at also not just how much time do they spend grooming, but how equitable is their grooming, lots and lots of different ways at looking at this. And across the board, it's true that you basically invest more in your mutual friends. And it's always important to remember here that these older adults have more mutual friends. So a lot of their social time is really spent investing in these strong social bonds. And so when we watch these old male chimps, like here on the left, we have Stout, who is about 58 in this video, and he's sitting next to and grooming one of his really, really old buddies, Big Brown, who is about 52 in this video. And this is just kind of, I think, really indicative of what these old male chimps, their lives are like. They're just kind of sitting around with their buddy, grooming each other. And Stout has since passed since this video was taken, but Big Brown is actually going strong and doing quite well in our group. I want to point out what's interesting about some of these results to me is that these males who are aging are not high ranking. So male dominance rank actually peaks around the age of 30. That's when they'll have their highest lifetime rank. And then as they age, they actually lose rank. So the fact that they're still popular and others want to be around them is really interesting, because they're not popular because they're high ranking. We also know from our data that they're losing muscle mass. So these old male chimps are not in their peak condition. They're actually they're not exactly frail. They're doing pretty well, but they are not, their big, robust selves of their youth. So in terms of, kind of fighting ability, they're going to be lacking in that kind of thing. We know that their testosterone is decreasing with age, and that's going to go hand in hand with the decrease in muscle mass that we see, but also probably hand in hand with that decrease in aggression that we're showing. And so we know that testosterone has an important kind of modulating effect on aggressive behavior. And so we have nice data sets that all kind of come together. But what I think is really interesting is that we do not see deficits in their reproduction or reproductive ability. So of the 40 or so chimpanzee infants that we have paternity data for, because we don't know their fathers until we actually get DNA from them, about a quarter of them were sired by old males. And we actually see that copulation rates, whether they're with parous females, those are females who have had babies before, or nulliparous females who have not had babies before, regardless of the kind of female. And I should say parous females are the really, really attractive females, so the ones that the males are really excited about when they have a swelling. There's no difference, there's just no change in their copulation behaviors. So these males are older, they're losing muscle mass, they have lower testosterone, they don't have high dominance rank, but they're still getting copulation. So and they're still really socially popular. So, I mean, in some ways, these male chimps are like living their best life. It seems like a really good thing in many ways. They seem to be very healthy. So what we're finding is that chimpanzees actually do share this social aging pattern with humans, but they're doing it without that sense of mortality and that without that deep understanding of time. And that, I think, causes us to reassess what's really happening, what does really psychologically explain this phenomenon. And we argue in the paper that this might have to do with the fact that humans and chimpanzees probably share patterns and abilities to regulate their emotions. And one of the things that we know about humans is that as humans age, they get much, much better at regulating their emotional states compared to their youth. And that might also be happening in chimpanzees. When we compare our patterns with what we see or what is known about other primates, we actually look to monkeys. There's a little bit of data, and we actually know from other studies that monkeys, as they age, actually show a negativity bias. So that means that the chimp-human pattern is really, really different. There's also no evidence in monkeys for this more selective behavior with respect to social relationships. And so there might be something here that's very special about chimps and humans. What we need is data from the other great apes, so bonobos and gorillas and orangutans, for example, to really understand whether this is an ape pattern or something, or just something that is shared between chimps and humans. So that I would make a call out to other primatologists to go get that data. And finally, I think we have a lot of future questions which we are interested in asking. Certainly, we want to know why these friendships exist. Why are Stout and Big Brown so close? What is it doing for them? And one of the things that I think is happening here that we still need to test is the fact that maybe these friendships allow these males, when females are swollen and when there's a reproductive opportunity, to form a coalition with a trusted buddy and actually, use aggression very strategically with a friend to try to have access or get access from of those females away from the dominant male. So I think the function of these friendships might be really, really important for these old males. It's a really open question about what's happening with females and how their social relationships change with age. I think that's going to be one of our next studies. The data from humans does not discriminate, does not talk about males and females separately. The data from humans also doesn't distinguish between non-relative friends and spouses and relationships we have with children. And so I think we have to be a little bit more creative about how we study females, considering they are not very social, and so we might not be able to use the same kind of metrics, but that's definitely something we are interested in. And I will say that our preliminary, very, very preliminary data suggests that maybe females are actually showing a different pattern than the males with respect to social aging, and I think that's something we need to really look at. So what can we learn from this? How can we kind of think differently about human aging? Well, I think one thing that is true about humans and these chimps is that older individuals in both species do have a lot of social value, despite declining abilities. In humans, a lot of our social value comes from wisdom and from the knowledge that we have. It's not entirely clear yet what the social value is for these old chimps, but I think it's true that across both species, we're seeing that older individuals have a lot of value. What's also kind of interesting is that because chimps and humans are showing this same pattern, this might be part of a natural and evolutionarily selected feature of aging. And so the fact that human social networks shrink, and to some extent chimpanzee social networks shrink as well, but they become more positive, is part of a deep evolutionary history. Like, this pattern has this deep evolutionary history. And the kind of practical advice that I would think we could learn from this is that when we think about human social aging, I think there have been so many programs to kind of get seniors out and meeting new people and doing new things. And really, that's not part of our natural aging process. That's not something that maybe we are evolutionarily designed to do. Instead, what we may want to focus on is giving seniors opportunities to really focus in on their strong social bonds, to not worry so much if their social networks are shrinking, but to prioritize opportunities for them to maintain the bonds that they have with their old friends and give them opportunities to do that rather than pushing them into these kinds of new situations. So I hope that's something that we can kind of take away from this, and that we don't need to look at human aging as just a loss of things or deficits or as kind of a pattern of disease, but that this is really maybe part of healthy social aging. I'd also just like to make a shout out to the fact that I think this study really highlights the value of long-term research of wild primates, but all wild species. We did not start our field site 33 years ago to test socio-emotional selectivity theory, but we constructed our data collection procedures in ways that we can ask incredibly interesting questions that go beyond just understanding chimpanzee behavior or evolution, behavioral ecology, but that this data is actually being used to understand humans in a pretty important and interesting way. I will say that none of this can be done alone. So we have an enormous staff in Uganda helping us collect this data. This was a truly collaborative project. And also we have a lot of different sources of funding to allow us to do this work, including Harvard University. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you're interested to learn more about our field site, you can check out our webpage, but we're also pretty active on Facebook and Twitter if you'd like to follow us there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zarin. I'd like to transition to the Q&A portion of our program. I should first mention that we received over 80 pre-submitted questions. So we have grouped some of them based on similar topics and themes. We invite you to continue to send your questions to the Q&A box or the YouTube chat. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Let's begin our conversation with the two most asked questions. So the first one, are there any gender-based differences in aging chimps?
Yeah, so I think that there probably are. I mean, I think it's a really important question, but we don't have the answers yet. And so that's kind of the next study. In studies of monkeys, what we have found, other people have found is that males and females do differ in their patterns of social aging with age. So I wouldn't be surprised that that happens. And if I think about it, our idea is that these bonds are actually quite valuable for reproduction for these older male chimps. And that's probably not going to be the case with females. And in many ways, females are often competitive with one another because they're fighting over food, whether directly or indirectly. And that might actually get harder for females as they age. So it might actually result in these females becoming kind of less social.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Our next question, are chimps susceptible to Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia as they age? If not, why not?
Yeah, I think, so it's interesting. There has been some data from neurobiologists who studied brains of chimpanzees. And there has been recently some data that suggests that in chimpanzee brains as they age, there are kind of the precursor anatomical changes that are related to Alzheimer's, but there is no data and no evidence that chimpanzees show any sort of behavioral kind of indications of that kind of memory loss, or even one of the characteristic signs of Alzheimer's, kind of like a precursor to Alzheimer's, is that we often lose the ability as we age to do two things at once. So like walking and talking. That's kind of an early sign. And we certainly don't, it's hard to know what that might look like for chimps, but we're not seeing any sort of behavioral deficits that are akin to Alzheimer's, but some evidence that there is, at least in the brain, some structural changes that are similar.
Interesting. A similar question, might your research with chimps shed any light on changes in short and long-term memory health?
Yeah, I think some people, again, I think it may be, like these studies about neuroanatomy might tell us something about how the brain structure might change. In terms of the wild studies, again, I'm not sure that we're able to really capture a lot of that. We don't really have I think a lot of that kind of work would have to be done experimentally with captive chimps. And there are quite a number of people, including my collaborator, Alex Rosati, who has studied memory in chimps. With captive chimps, we run into a little bit of a problem with like a sample size issue where we might only have a few individuals who are older. And so we don't necessarily get these studies like with humans where we have hundreds of individuals. So I think that's it's a little bit of a challenge to do that.
Thank you. The next question, is there a noticeable difference in captive versus free living chimps as they get older with their aging and their abilities?
So yeah, to some extent, one of the biggest differences with captive chimps versus wild chimps is their body size. So captive chimps across, lots of different kinds of captive situations tend to weigh a lot more, which is not maybe that surprising because they're not able to be that active, and yet they still eat a lot. So we do see kind of chimps in captivity be a little bit heavier, in some cases actually obese, what we might define as obese. And that does have, in many ways, an impact on their health. So sometimes you see captive chimps actually having shorter lifespans than wild chimps. I think also what we're finding in captive chimps is some interesting data on cardiovascular health. And this might have to do, again, with a more sedentary lifestyle, a very different diet than you see in the wild, much less, wild foods is very different from what they're getting in captivity. Right. And so you see, some impact on cardiovascular health that, we're not seeing evidence of that in the wild. But to be fair, when our chimpanzees die, we sometimes are able to collect the body to do a necropsy, but not always. And we're doing this in field conditions. So, I know this sounds kind of gross, but like, when we get a body back and want to do an autopsy, we kind of just take our kitchen table and use that as a way of doing it, because we don't have like veterinary facilities at our field site. So we're a little bit limited what we can do with kind of physical health, like, doing autopsies or necropsies of our wild chimps. But it does seem like they do have more cardiovascular issues.
So many folks have inquired about bonobos, which I know you very briefly mentioned, Zarin. So I've grouped together this next question. Is there similar research involving gorillas, bonobos, or orangutans?
Yeah, so there are lots of long-term field sites that would have the same kind of data that we do, especially the gorillas who have been studied. The research site that Diane Fossey started decades ago is still running, collecting lots and lots of data on groups. So they would certainly have the same kinds of data. Bonobos is a little bit trickier. They haven't been studied as long. And so again, you do need a certain amount of data to ask these questions about a long-lived species, but they certainly would have that kind of data. Orangutans are a little trickier because as one of the great apes, they're actually pretty asocial. So there is some social behavior, and they measure sociality in slightly kind of broad ways. So for an orangutan, being social is kind of like, are you within 50 meters of another orangutan? And that is considered social time, which is very different than social time for a chimp or for a human. And again, there are longstanding orang projects that would probably have data like that. And we would urge everyone who has that data to kind of look at it in this way, but it has not been done yet.
I see. Thank you. So we've seen some images and heard a brief mention of Jane Goodall. So let's use this next question to expand on that. Are you connected to Jane Goodall and her chimps?
So we are a different field site, but so Richard Wrangham, who started Kibale Chimp Project, who's a Harvard professor, he was actually in the 70s one of the first students who did his PhD at Jane Goodall's site. And so when he started our chimp project in the 80s, he actually designed our data collection in many ways based on what he knew from that site, and much of it parallels. So we end up collecting very similar kinds of data and in the same way. And because of that connection with our data, researchers from my site and researchers from the Gombe site have done a lot of collaborative work together. And so we are connected to them in the sense that we've done a lot of kind of papers comparing or contrasting our two sites. They are actually quite different. And with respect to aging, what's very interesting about the Gombe chimps is that they do have slightly shorter lifespans than the chimps at my field site. So whereas our chimps tend to live till they're about between 50 and 60 in the wild, the Gombe chimps, actually, their lifespan is more like 40 to 50. And one of the reasons for that is we think that those chimps are actually infected with, not all of them, but some of them have simian immunodeficiency virus, which is kind of the chimp version of HIV. And we think that that's actually had an impact. So that disease kind of has had an impact on kind of their life history and how they age. So that's interesting, but we've done a lot of collaborative work, especially for me on hunting behavior. So it kind of not really related to this, but so yeah, and we love that. I mean, we're really close, like we're all friends with each other.
Great, thank you. The next question, is there evidence that adult chimps interact differently with other adults whom they perceive to be younger or older than them?
Yeah, so I think hopefully the data spoke to that a little, where it does seem that all of these chimps really like these older individuals. And remember that these males have all kind of grown up together, like they've all been there their entire lives. So they have a pretty good sense of who is older and who, I mean, how long they've been around. And so, for example, a chimp, born in the 90s would have known Big Brown, has known Big Brown for their entire life and has known him as an adult male. So yeah, I think they do seem to be really drawn to these older individuals. We also see some strong social bonds with relatives, so especially brothers who are close in age. So that seems to also pattern their behavior.
This is a really interesting next question. To what extent are the emotional expressions of chimps the same or similar to ours? For example, the basic 6 to 8 non-representational emotions.
So I think that we have a lot of similarities. I mean, it's very obvious. I'm kind of anthropomorphizing a little bit, but it's very obvious to me if a chimp is scared, if they're angry, if they're happy. It's hard to kind of operationalize that in terms of like trying to come up with a wild study that actually, gets at what their internal state is or what they're thinking. And so I think it's really obvious to chimp researchers that we have very similar emotional responses, but it's hard to test. It's hard to do a study about it. And it's harder to get at some things that are a little bit more complicated, like empathy. Do I think that chimpanzees have empathy? There's a good part of me that thinks that they do, but for us as researchers, the question is always going to be, how do we test that? How do we actually know that chimps have empathy, and how do we do a scientific study that would show that? And I think that's it's more a question of not what do we know, but how do we know what we know? And that's where I think it's hard to access some of the internal states of these animals in the wild.
Thank you. This is another popular question coming in. Do aging chimpanzees get cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, so again, it does seem like in captivity, they might be having some kind of cardiovascular issues. So do gorillas actually in captivity. It's actually more of a problem with gorillas than it is with chimps. In the wild, it does not seem to be the case. So, and actually, there's some, I am going to fail to actually remember what the result is, but someone just recently actually from our site published a paper on cholesterol. And again, I'm going to fail to find it, but I think if people are interested, they could Google cholesterol in chimpanzees, and there were some news articles written about it.
Great, I'm sure we can find that one. So we've got time for one last question here, and I'd like to end on this one. What is one piece of advice a chimp would offer us about maintaining our quality of life as we age?
I think keep your friends close. I think really I think they are very good at focusing on the social bonds that matter and that are mutually satisfying. And that In many ways, having a few good friends is better than having a lot of, acquaintances or a lot of more flaky kinds of relationships. So keep your friends close. They're important.
I agree. Thank you. Zarin, on behalf of the Harvard travel team and our alumni community, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and research with us today. Shortly, you will receive a follow-up email, including a virtual guide, which has the recording of this lecture and other resources. We hope you'll join us in the new year for our next travel talk, A Tale of Two Poles, presented by David Aguilar, the former director of Public Affairs and Science Information at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Thank you again for joining us. We wish you a very safe and relaxing holiday season.